Ever wondered why some composers' chord progressions sound like this? And others sound like this. The first one sounds super complex, but it still seems to work seamlessly, even though maybe it shouldn't. I mean, he's not even sticking to chords from the same key signature, for heaven's sakes. The second sounds basic, predictable, and makes me feel a lot of feelings about how embarrassed I am that I wrote it. Even though they're all chords from the key of C, so technically they should work together. And yet, it leaves me feeling colder than some fake internet millionaire selling courses about his cold plunge routine. Today we'll take a look at 3 reasons why that first progression works so well, aside from the fact that Ravel wrote it and he's a freaking genius, and we'll see what we can learn from those concepts that we can apply to our own chord progressions. Maybe I can even salvage my super boring cold plunge progression from earlier. You may have noticed by now that I don't really care much about staying within the confines of a key signature, and this may be a radical concept to some of you, but stick with me because the things that I'm going to show you today have been around for a long time, like well over a century at this point. But for some reason, they're almost never talked about in this way, even though I think a lot of your favorite artists may be using these concepts without even thinking about them. Key signatures are remnants of functional harmony, which is probably the kind of harmony that you're most familiar with, especially if you've studied any Western music theory. But unfortunately, this is what often gets taught on YouTube as composition. It's kind of conflated with composition. And it kind of traps a lot of young composers and producers into a very boxed-in way of thinking about music, especially how to put chords together in their progressions. Functional harmony is predictable harmony because we've heard it so many times. It has become almost a cliche to us that 5 goes to 1. In functional harmony, we give every single scale degree a number. We assign it a name, and we determine how it functions based on how it relates to a few certain notes. There's like a hierarchy of chords within a set scale. So it's very formulaic, and it was born out of a time period that was all about formulas, the late Renaissance, where everyone was figuring out the scientific method, and they were figuring out ways to apply that to music and the arts as well. But instead of thinking of chords only in terms of how they relate to a set number of other chords, why don't we think of each chord as being like a different color? Maybe more like each chord can be its own key area instead of within the structure of a key signature. Now, this throws the hierarchy out the window, and then that makes us wonder, well, how do we choose chords other than just randomly throwing them together? Well, they're not random, they just follow a different set of guidelines. Now we choose chords based on harmonic consistency, which we'll talk about a little bit later, harmonic freshness, which is a very important one that we're about to talk about, and then once we figure out how those 2 principles work with each other, our own taste. So we're choosing chords based on how we like the sound of them. What a concept. But in particular, the important thing is how they sound together in context, hence chord progression. I stole this term harmonic freshness directly from my composition teacher, sorry Mr. Zananelli, because it so perfectly describes this phenomenon to me. Just listen to that Ravel passage again. Each chord feels like it belongs, never like it's forced, but it also feels like a fresh new color that wasn't spoiled by the chord that came before it, or the color that came before it. Each chord feels fresh. But how do we accomplish this? How do we achieve this in our own writing? Well, first of all, if we repeat one chord more than the other chords, we've signaled to the listener that that is the most important chord. It feels like home base for us. Since we're not within a key signature, it kind of serves the purpose of feeling like tonic, or the root chord. It centers our progression around that chord, and so that can make our chord progressions start to feel circular, like they're just an endless loop, rather than they're going on a musical journey, like a musical phrase, or almost like melodic writing would. Secondly, we have to make sure we aren't tipping our hand and giving away sort of the punchline of the next chord in the previous chord. This used to be called telegraphing. I don't know what the modern equivalent of telegraphing is. We can avoid telegraphing by making sure we don't have too many of the same notes in between two successive chords. Now, in my very boring chord progression from the beginning of this video, I demonstrate both of these problems very clearly. I repeat the same chord too often, and therefore it centers and feels circular. And I give away the next chord in the previous chord too many times by having too many of the same notes shared between each one. So instead of feeling like each one goes to a fresh, new color, it feels like a pale shade of the color that came before it. I really hope this color analogy is working. Now, there is another potential issue with writing in this non-functional kind of way, and that might be simply that we know a lot of chords. We know a lot of ways to put notes together. We have a large harmonic vocabulary, and that's typically a good thing, but there is something to watch out for. The larger our vocabulary, just like in language, the more increased chance there is that we will say something that we don't really mean if we don't fully understand the meaning of the words that we're using. Like, I can use big, colorful language, but if I don't fully understand the context in which that word is most impactful, I probably just shouldn't use it at all. We understand a word fully when we understand the context in which it's most effective. The same goes for harmony. This is something that I hear a lot, even in some more experienced composers who might be really technically proficient with an instrument, or maybe they know more music theory. There are more options available for them to pull from, but maybe not a full understanding of when and where those things are most effective, the context. So people might use words like unfocused, meandering, or the dreaded pretentious to describe their work. When I was studying composition, my teacher introduced me to this concept of harmonic consistency. And that totally changed the way I thought about putting notes together. He introduced me to this concept of there being different harmonic languages. We only need 2 chords to establish a harmonic language. And once we've done that, we have to be very conscientious of whether or not to break that harmonic language that we've established. I demonstrated that concept in a video a while back. This is why Ravel always sounds like Ravel. Prokofiev always sounds like Prokofiev. Nine Inch Nails always sounds like Nine Inch Nails. If I stripped it all down and played just the harmonies, you would never confuse one composer with another in this group of composers or bands, even though they're all using a lot of the same compositional principles and harmonic principles. The very same ones that I try to teach and put into words on this channel. And it's simply because they've developed their own harmonic language and they've stayed consistent within that language and they've learned to be creative within their own set of limitations. They understand that what they choose not to do with great intention is just as important in defining their art as what they choose to do, their restraints, their self-imposed limitations. If you'd like to learn more about these concepts, I have a free Harmony ebook. That is a great companion to my composition ebook. It goes into more detail about these concepts of harmonic consistency and harmonic freshness and gives examples of how I like to think of them and use them. It's free, available in the description below if you're interested. The final piece to this puzzle of what makes Ravel's progression, despite the fact that he's a genius and I'm not, so much better than mine, is linearity. You've heard me, if you've been around the channel for a while, talk about the difference between horizontal writing and vertical writing. Now, there is one reason why I'm not naming every one of these chords as I play them. And the reason for that is, I just don't care. And you know what? I don't think Ravel really cared either. I think there's a lot more musical things happening here that just arbitrarily naming a chord for the sake of trying to figure out how something functions ignores. I think what Ravel was going for was these shapes. So we can see how those chords are moving outward. They're sequences within sequences. Most importantly, they have a musical, almost melodic shape to each one of the voices in the chords. And that's exactly what I mean when I say think horizontally or linearly instead of vertically with your chords. So now that I've made a few adjustments, my progression doesn't sound like it centers or telegraphs anymore. But it's still a boring series of blocked vertical triads. Whereas Ravel's progression doesn't really even sound like a progression at all. It sounds like a musical thought, like it goes on a journey. It tells a story and has an almost melodic shape to it. And we can accomplish this by using inversions and redistributions to revoice these chords into something that does go on a musical journey and have a much more musical melodic shape to it. If you'd like to learn more about that and see how that works, you need to watch this video right here.